A little bit about Hauser, Henry & Siren. We're a boutique business law firm. Our focus is on mid-sized private companies, and that'll be the topic for my discussion today. Mid-market companies that are either family businesses, entrepreneurs, or foreign businesses, subsidiaries of foreign businesses doing business here in Canada. We help businesses on a full range of business issues, from day-to-day operations to transactions. We aim to give strategic advice in plain English and do it efficiently. Welcome. Thank you everyone for coming this morning. And my name is Mike Henry, and I'll be leading our seminar discussion this morning. I've got Robin Beamish with me. Robin was the president of Beamish Construction, leading business in the road building industry for 70 years. And last year, the Beamish family decided to sell the business, and Robin will share some of his insights and experiences from that. I want to talk about three themes that consistently appear in M&A transactions. The first is planning, the second is people, and the third is process. And when a transaction goes well, those aspects are addressed carefully and thoughtfully. So let's talk first about planning. There's an old expression that's hard to get somewhere if you don't know where you're going. It's important in any transaction, in any business venture, to have a clear objective. So it's exciting and flattering when there's an inquiry about buying a business. And business owners are often, frankly, really complimented by that. And it is truly a compliment when a business is recognized as an attractive target for somebody else. But the fundamental question that we should all be asking ourselves in those cases is the business ready to be sold? Let's keep in mind that every business is a work in process. But it's important that, as on the sell side, that there's time taken to prepare a business for sale. Is the business owner ready for change? Sometimes that's the biggest weakness in a business. Because if the business owner isn't ready to embrace the next stage of his or her career, then it's often difficult to move the business forward in a way that would be attractive to a buyer. I find there's often a fascinating contrast between entrepreneurs who are bold risk takers, who are disrupting in business, who are challenging competitors, who are finding opportunities that others don't see. All of that risk-taking and boldness seems to shrink when it turns to the question of what's the future of the business, what's the succession plan. And in those cases, there's often procrastination, sometimes there's delay, deferral, and the problems begin to accumulate. If the owner isn't really ready to change, then it can become, unfortunately, a waiting game until problems accumulate, whether it's a business downturn, loss of a key customer, loss of key staff, something like that. And then, unfortunately, the business is being sold not because it's an optimal case, not because it's the right time, because it has to be sold. And then it's sold often at a discount. And that's something, as advisors, we never really want to see. Now, once a decision is made to sell a business, the next steps are really to begin, as I said, to try and remedy or address any issues in the business that are weaknesses. That can take some time, maybe a year, maybe 2 years. That's a long horizon. But once that decision is made, there's preparation for addressing what's the typical due diligence that a buyer is going to look for. And typically, there's a 6, 7, 8-page chart, a laundry list of all sorts of questions, financial statements, employment contracts, tax returns, depending on it's an asset or share deal. And the buyer's questions are typically the same. And so from the seller's perspective, a lot of work can be done to organize that and have it ready. And when the seller can present a crisp, well-organized due diligence response, it instills confidence in the seller's running of the business and the seller's knowledge of the business. Ultimately, the seller wants the buyer to believe, and hopefully it's true, that the seller is an informed owner. The seller knows what's going on, knows the risks, knows the strengths. Once the decision is made, either on the buy side or the sell side, it's important that a group of advisors are assembled and that they're working together. Someone needs to be a quarterback. It's very difficult to quarterback a deal and continue running a business. So that's an important role that advisors can help with. The buyer needs to make plans too, although the planning is probably not quite as deep and long and taking as long. whether it's structuring the deal as an asset sale or asset purchase or a share purchase, financing, whether there's going to be a purchase of all the shares, for example, of the vendor, or it's going to be a purchase of some of them, and there'll be a continuation of working together for a period. So that planning is all important too. Now, the next aspect that's critical in a successful M&A transaction is addressing the people aspects. And I want to be clear that there's no hope in these things of changing someone's personality. And every deal will be different because it's going to be colored by the personality, the experiences of the people involved. But what we can do is assess the dynamic within the group, and it will always be slightly different, and anticipate how to keep the discussion constructive while recognizing that people have different personalities. Fit matters considerably. This is often the biggest deal of a business owner's career. So, and Robin will talk more about that, and it matters essentially to know that the buyer and seller have common values, have a common outlook, are looking to accomplish something similar. Now, the other key issue on people matters are employees. In any kind of transaction, it's important to consider what are the consequences for employees, how to engage key employees, how to preserve that value. And that's a delicate balance because on one hand, certain key employees need to know at an early stage about the transaction on the sell side. On the other side, the seller doesn't want those key employees to be spooked or alarmed or to feel insecure, doesn't want the buyer to start dropping hints as who's going to stay and who won't. That's hugely disruptive and something that needs to be managed very carefully. Often starting with a non-disclosure agreement, a letter of intent. A letter of intent, I think, is essential. It's almost a test of the consensus among the parties. If we're going to 3, 4, 5 drafts of a letter of intent, there's a problem with this deal. There isn't a consensus, and there needs to be more of a discussion on the business level. The due diligence, as I mentioned before, it's important that the seller prepare as much as it can, anticipate what's going to be reasonably requested and have that ready. Due diligence requests can be overwhelming, especially if the person on the seller is running a business at the same time and has a 7-8 page due diligence memo to respond to, and that's where advisors can help. And often the question will come on the employment side, what are the contracts, what's been, and very often there aren't contracts. Maybe there aren't, somebody's been working for 30 years, there wasn't an employment agreement. So there needs to at least be some summary of the key terms so that the buyer can understand what is the risk that the buyer would be taking on by taking on these employees. We're seeing more and more that due diligence doesn't stop before the purchase agreement is drafted. In other words, previously, it was typical to finish the due diligence and then draft the agreement, or at least finish most of it and then draft the agreement. But more commonly now, on tight time frames, the pressure is to draft the agreement at the same time as doing the due diligence. And that's often an inefficiency because, as you could imagine, if something startling is revealed in the due diligence, then it should be incorporated in the purchase agreement. As I mentioned, once the agreement is in play, it's often helpful to pause and assess the direction of the transaction. We can usually tell if you're receiving an agreement by the first draft whether this agreement is going to be hard fought or it's going to move fairly smoothly, whether there's overreaching or whether it's consistent with the letter of intent. We've got to keep in mind that the letter of intent terms will often change, and that's sometimes a surprise to the seller, but it shouldn't be because there's an evolution of the discussion. Now, if it's a dramatic change, that's a problem, but usually there is some evolution. The employment issues become critical to the deal because the buyer is reluctant to assume significant potential termination costs by taking on older employees, long service, and so there's often a lot of discussion over how is that liability to be shared. Is it entirely on one side, entirely on the other side, or is there some compromise whereby the potential costs of termination within a period after closing are to be shared? Completion, closing, there are always the unexpected things that arise at closing, so that's something to be prepared for. It's always important to be ready for that. There may be delays caused by third parties like landlords or suppliers or distributors that don't have a vested interest in closing on time. After closing, Often there's a deferred payment, often an earn-out, and then sometimes there can be questions about representations and warranties and what's happened after closing and whether there might be a claim on indemnities or something like that.